Okay, in this lecture we're going to talk about Jefferson and Madison's presidency, so we're moving along the early republic a little bit, and we'll also be talking about the War of 1812, which happens in Madison's presidency. So very famously, the election of 1800 is the very first time in American history that we have a peaceful transfer of power between political parties, and so that's why, a lot of people remember this. Also, John Adams, who you might remember from the Alien and Sedition Acts last time, goes against Thomas Jefferson, who's the leader of the Democratic-Republican parties. The Democratic-Republican parties essentially sweep Congress, and this is really because, again, of the Alien and Sedition Acts and everything that happened with that. Adams doesn't even get second place. Aaron Burr actually gets second place, and the tie goes to the House of Representatives. Okay, so there's been not enough of them getting a majority to become president, so the way the Constitution is written, it goes to the House of Representatives to break the tie. Neither one of the men received a majority, like I said. Hamilton, believe it or not, the head of the Federalist Party, eventually steps in to make the decision. And Aaron Burr, is expecting Hamilton to throw his way since Jefferson is the leader of the Democratic-Republican Party. But much to the chagrin of Burr, he throws his weight to Jefferson because Hamilton felt he was picking the lesser of two evils. Now, even though this is not the immediate effect is not the duel like in the Hamilton play, which is amazing, it takes about 4 years for them to go to duel over this. But this is really the fire that is really starting to be stoked between the two of them. So this gives you an idea of the election map, and you can see in here that, Adams comes in third. And so this means that Jefferson will be the president, and the way that they had it written at that time, the vice president would become the runner-up. Can you imagine if we had that today? Not so great. They do pass the 12th Amendment in 1804, which changed the way they selected the electoral votes. One of the electoral votes would go to the president and the other to the vice president. And that's why today we have political parties run on a ticket together. So like Trump and Pence and Biden and Harris that we have today. Eventually, there will be a duel between Burr and Hamilton, and for your interest, I will put a good video clip on the duel between them. Everybody is particularly interested in this duel because of the Hamilton play, and so that'll give you some historical background to it. But what really happens because of 1800 is the slow death of the Federalist Party. We're never again going to see a Federalist president like we did with Adams. And this is just a response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, so that's really the end of that. Jefferson's presidency from 1801 to 1809, so he serves 2 terms. The highlights of what it really looked like, he wanted a limited role of the federal government. He pardons anybody who's in jail for the Sedition Acts and anybody who violated the Whiskey Acts. He tries to have this type of, he was the Secretary of State under Washington, and so he has this very positive relationship, or tries to, with foreign countries. He does pay off part of the national debt. He gets away from the big buildup of the military, okay? I encourage you to watch, there's a really great clip also below this on Jefferson's presidency, and that gives you quite a bit of insight into him as a president. Probably one of the things that Jefferson's most known for, though, during his presidency was the purchase of Louisiana. So, give you a little bit of context behind this. Napoleon Bonaparte is ruling France, and he's in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars with Great Britain, and Spain too. It's almost like a world war going on at the same time. And essentially, he takes back the area west of the Mississippi that was taken from them after the French and Indian War, and Spain was controlling that. So he literally takes that back from Spain. At the same time, but simultaneously, there's a Haitian slave revolt, and that is the only part of North America that France had controlled before Napoleon becomes, rises to power. That is, after the French and Indian War. So, because of the slave revolt and because of the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon finds himself in dire need of money. And so now he's got this territory west of the Mississippi that he took back from Spain that he doesn't really need, and he doesn't really want to pay the money to kind of control it. Now, on the other side, here in America, Thomas Jefferson was very concerned about the fact that the French now took back control of that area, mainly because we had put together a treaty called Pinckney's Treaty in 1794, which essentially gave us navigational rights down the Mississippi and control of trade, and some trade in the port of New Orleans. And so he sends, James Monroe and Robert Livingston to France in order to negotiate a treaty and, give $15 million to have navigational rights down the Mississippi. So he just wanted to, take a portion of that lower part of the Mississippi and New Orleans port, but to his surprise, because of Napoleon's dire need to take in money because of his own, situation, Napoleon's like, I'm going to give you the whole thing for $15 million. So, of course, they take him up on that. That was a very, very, big thing. Essentially what happens is that adds 828,000 square miles to the United States. It doubles the size. It's considered in American history like the best real estate deal in American history. What's interesting about this is that Jefferson himself is what we call a strict constitutionalist. Okay, he wanted to interpret the Constitution strictly. So this puts him in kind of a conundrum because Jefferson had said and criticized Hamilton for doing the national bank that was not in the Constitution. And so he uses that elastic clause, ironically, himself to buy Louisiana. So a little bit of a historical conundrum. Okay, one of the biggest cases during this time, and I'm going to move my my little person up here, was a case called Marbury versus Madison. So I won't go into too much detail about the background of the case itself, but this is an important case for the reason that it establishes something we still use today known as judicial review. So essentially what happens in this case is John Adams, who is the lame duck president towards the end of 1800, does something known as midnight appointments. He throws a bunch of judicial appointments into all of the federal court cases to try to load the federal courts with Federalist people in it, right? And so these are called late night appointments. And Jefferson, when he gets into office, is very upset about this, and he refuses to honor some of these appointments. Well, one of those people was a guy named Marbury, and he says, well, I've been promised that case, and so he sues the U.S. government. James Madison was the Secretary of State at the time, so he sues them to get the position. So the ruling of the court was basically this case, and what John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice, yes, John Marshall High School is named after him, was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at that time. He essentially said that they didn't have the power to force Jefferson to make the appointment, so it wasn't technically under his power. But what they do is something historic, and that is that they look back at what Washington made with the Judiciary Act of 1789 and said that's in fact unconstitutional. So he's the very first time they look at a law that was made by Congress, signed in by the president, and said it's unconstitutional. And they call that judicial review. So what this case really, really does is that establishes the fact that the Supreme Court is now an equal branch to the other two branches, because at the time it really wasn't. It was just like side note. It was really like the two branches of government, not so much the three. But with this case itself, it elevates it to an equal branch, and it also establishes the Supreme Court as the final authority on any cases, and says that what happens is that the Supreme Court will look at laws passed and determine its constitutionality. Okay, so you've got John Marshall here making sure you understand why that case is so important. Arguably the most important case in American history because it establishes so much power. Okay, so economically, Jefferson has an issue. The issue is that Britain and France are continuing to fight, and there are international laws that would allow neutral nations, which would be us, to trade non-military goods still during wartime. And so we continue to try to trade with Europe, manufacturing. But Great Britain and France were both trying to block us from helping each other out, providing any supplies or anything like that. And so in retaliation, Jefferson passes something called the Embargo Act of 1807, essentially stopped foreign ships or American ships from being in contact at all with any ships in Europe. In an effort to kind of push France and Great Britain from, doing impressment and things like that to our ships. He wanted to kind of make them realize that they needed American goods. The reality is, though, that he goes against his big government viewpoint when he imposes this, because he wanted more of a laissez-faire, hands-off kind of attitude. And what he does is really affect the economy in a negative manner. Manufacturing drops by 80%. Neither France or Great Britain really cared that much. They just found other sources to trade with, so it ended up affecting us and not them. And in response, Jefferson imposes something called the Non-Intercourse Acts, and that would just stop trade between France and Great Britain. But unfortunately for Jefferson, it had the exact same thing. So I'm going to give you a minute to see if you can figure this out, okay? And you can pause it because I'm going to give you the answer in just a minute. So if you want to try to figure this out, I'm going to tell you the clue behind here, okay? I'm going to give you a sec to pause. Okay, so if you take a look at this, it says, probably trying to say, damn it, how he nicks me. And this is a turtle with a license there. This is in the background is the Great Britain ships, probably trying to trade with them. But this guy that's trying to trade is saying, oh, this cursed, oh, grab me. And if you take a minute, why would they call him the oh, grab me turtle? So if you look at that, you might want to pause it if you want to really figure this out. It's embargo backwards. Okay, so oh, grab me is embargo backwards. So it's a very famous political cartoon from that time. So as you can tell, Americans were not really pleased with this embargo act, okay, and the non-intercourse, because it really hurt them economically. Okay, so Madison becomes president for another 2 terms right after Jefferson, and now we're continuing with the Democratic Republican parties. So again, he's part of the Democratic Republicans. Just to put it in perspective, Great Britain and France are still at war when he comes in. The economy is still bad because of the Embargo and Non-Intercourse Act. Madison reimposes the same thing, basically does a lot of the same things that Jefferson does, okay? However, people in Congress are starting to get very antsy over this treatment, particularly from the British, because even though the British with Jay's Treaty said that they would get out of our forts, there still is a presence of British soldiers, believe it or not, okay, in the early 1800s, still in the United States. And so in particular, people that begin to call for war against Great Britain again are known as the War Hawks. Okay, these are people that wanted to go to war. This is led by one person in particular, Henry Clay, and several other. He's going to be a very powerful politician that we'll talk about quite a bit. But anyway, they want to go to war with Great Britain, and they also want to grab Florida and Canada. Okay, interestingly enough, we do go for a Canadian grab during this time. So in 1812, the War of 1812, we do go into what's known as America's Second Revolutionary War, which is the War of 1812. This is a war again against America and Great Britain. We also have the issue of dealing with Native Americans and their rights to land. The scary part is, for America, is that Britain is still extremely powerful, but they are very preoccupied with dealing with France. America itself is fighting a 2-front war, Native Americans in the West and the British along the East Coast, because the British are going to team up and try to encourage Native Americans once again to go against the Americans. The reality of it is that it becomes a war where nobody gains anything. It's a 2-year-long war. It's a pretty short war. And there's, I'll see if I can find a clip for you guys on the burning of the White House. Really funny story there. But essentially what happens is that at the end of the war, there's really no changes. No land and rules or land being created. Nothing really happens. It kind of ends up just being a draw in it. Okay. The effects of the war are incredibly important, though. Okay, America gets, respect. We find a new hero that we're going to talk about quite a bit in next week's module, Andrew Jackson, and there are enormous economic effects. Okay, so first of all, America gets respect by the rest of the world, saying, "Oh, hey, they actually can hold the British off. They're a good nation." This type of what we call nationalism emerges. This is also where the Star Spangled Banner is created. The poem, at least, it wasn't put to or tagged as our national anthem or put to music until later. But this is when Francis Scott Keyes is a prisoner on a prison ship in Baltimore Harbor, and he sees Old Glory flying, and that is what the poem is about. By the way, if you go to the American History Museum in Washington, D.C., you can see Old Glory. It's on the bottom floor there. They've got it under low lights and everything. The other thing is Andrew Jackson is born as a war hero, and this is going to propel him to political fame and really put him into office. And at the end of this, there's a really hilarious clip that I hope you take the time to watch that explains the War of 1812 from a comedic perspective, and he does talk about Jackson quite a bit. But the biggest part, the one big takeaway you need to come back from the War of 1812 are the economic effects, okay? The loss of foreign goods and all the embargoes and everything that led up to it forces America to create its own American manufacturing, and that's going to be super important. There's a shortage on a lot of, northeastern manufactured goods. There's a shortage, and so they start to fill that shortage up. The government starts to impose tariffs and to support American manufacturers, and we see a market transportation and industrial revolution, number one, to first really come about because of the War of 1812. Okay, so that's about it. The next one will be one about the reform movements.